In Walmart's Who'Knewville, everyone ready their cart. Amazing Black Friday deals are about to start. Online and in the app, such great deals to explore. Everything you love from tech, toys, and more. The days to save and the ones to remember. It's only the 25th to the 30th of November. Set your alarms. Don't miss out. These deals are epic, without a doubt. The Who's are all ready, but are you? Walmart Black Friday deals await. Who knew?
Oh, Hilton stay, your beds are soft and cozy. No lumpy couch, no stiff futon, no shower line at crack of dawn. Oh, Hilton stay.
When you want holiday comfort you can count on, it matters where you stay. Enjoy comfortable rooms and friendly service when you stay with Hilton instead. Save up to 25% this season when you book with Hilton. Hilton for the stay. Terms apply.
Every single branch of President Roosevelt's wartime administration was penetrated by Soviet intelligence. That's revealed in the so-called Venona decrypts. OSS, America's wartime foreign intelligence agency, was probably the most penetrated agency ever in history. There were the Soviet moles throughout OSS. And in fact, OSS director William Wild Bill Donovan, he quipped once that he would put Stalin on the payroll of OSS if it meant defeating Hitler. Obviously, he meant that as a joke, but actually he was more accurate than he knew, because his right-hand man in OSS was a Soviet agent.
Welcome to the Spy Masters podcast. I'm your host, Antonia Senior. In this episode, I'll be talking to Dr Calder Walton. He's one of the world's leading experts on the history of intelligence, national security and geopolitics. We're delighted to have Dr Walton on the podcast. In fact, we're so delighted that we're doing 2 episodes looking at SPIES, his magisterial book, which tells the epic story of the intelligence war between East and West. In this first episode, we'll be looking at the development of the intelligence relationship between the Soviet Union and the West, starting with the Bolshevik Revolution itself and going all the way up to the end of the Cold War. Next time, we'll be looking at the post-Cold War landscape, Putin and the rising espionage threat from China. You don't want to miss it. Subscribe and follow us wherever you get your podcasts. And now it's over to me talking to Calder Walton. Calder, thank you so much for coming on the Spy Masters podcast. It's brilliant to have you.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
So your book is an incredible feat. It spans a huge amount of history. So we're going to talk today mainly about the era before the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I wanted to start with a image that you used that I completely adored. You say that in 1945, at the end of the Second World War, the American and British intelligence agencies were coming into a gunfight against the Soviet Union effectively with a toy bow and arrow. That was how far behind they were in this intelligence battle. And part of your argument is that's because Soviet intelligence against the West has a lot longer history than we necessarily think. We think of it as a Cold War phenomenon. Can you take us back to the beginning? And when and why the Soviet Union first started its foreign intelligence operations against the West?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm glad you liked that depiction. It just came into my mind when I was writing, and I think, well, that kind of captures what we're really talking about here. Well, it seems to me that the intelligence conflict between East and West, between the Soviet Union and the Western powers, it really all started off when the Bolsheviks seized power in Moscow in 1917, and then crucially, when the Western allies decided to intervene in the Russian Civil War. And this set in chain the perception, quite reasonable perception by Soviet leaders, that the Western world, the capitalist as they saw them, imperial powers, were out to get them. And this, of course, confirmed what Lenin and then Stalin already believed from their deep reading of Marx, that the capitalist powers would inevitably, to use the Marxist phrase, be out to get them, that there would be a class warfare between the bourgeois capitalist powers and communist Leninist powers. So inevitably, if you are coming from that mindset, it makes perfect sense that the Bolshevik Party, which after all, before 1917 had been a covert, clandestine, deeply conspiratorial party, well, once in power, and then once Lenin solidified Soviet rule and Bolshevik rule became the Soviet Union in the ensuing Russian Civil War, inevitably they would see enemies, both imagined and real, all around them, and that's where foreign intelligence came in. Absolutely central to the role of security and intelligence for the early Soviet state was, above all, keeping the Bolshevik Party in power, regime perseverance. And that has all sorts of echoes with today that I'm sure we'll get onto in the next episode.
There's a quite interesting echo already, that the constant debate about Soviet and indeed now Russian foreign policy is it defensive or is it aggressive? Or are the two things so completely interlinked that you can barely tell them apart? Because what you're saying, what you're presenting as a sort of Soviet sense that the West was out to get them, can also be presented as a Soviet desire to get the West to be, you know, to revolutionize the West, right? Because there's the revolutionary impulse. And can you actually separate out those two kind of impulses?
And as always in history, the reality is it's probably not one thing or the other, and it's a messy mixture of both. You're absolutely right that the sort of the revolutionary spirit infused by Marx set in chain this desire, strategy to bring the revolution to the outside Western world, of course. So in that respect, there is a offensive aggression on the part of the Bolshevik leaders, but at the same time, all of their worst fears were confirmed about what Western powers were doing at that early moment of the Russian Civil War, which, by the way, there's some good books that have been written about the first Cold War. That's what people have called it, that early period after the Civil War. And I think there's much to that this is really set in chain, this collision between East and West, which only really expressed itself later on in the century after 1945, which is where speaking for myself, that's how we learn it in school, that's when the Cold War started. But that earlier chapter that we're talking about right now is often omitted. Speaking to undergraduates here at Harvard University, most people don't know that America intervened in the Russian Civil War in that early period, in the early 1920s. It's news to them, but it's certainly not news to people, I would say, in Russian universities today at the same age. This is something that they learn about in school. So to answer your question, it's an absolute messy mixture. And the key thing, it seems to me, is that it's many of the same people, driving personalities involved in that early period that later resurfaced in the later period that we learn about after 1945. I'm thinking in particular of Stalin and Churchill. Churchill was, of course, sort of one of the lead champions of trying to overthrow the Bolsheviks in that early period. And of course, after Stalin gained power in the Kremlin, it only confirmed his worst fears about what Churchill was doing. The more he looked, the more he didn't like what he saw in the later period during the Second World War and onwards.
I think another sort of slightly common misconception among people who are sort of outside all of this is that secret police and espionage, etc., are very Stalinist. But actually, as you make clear in the book, it's Lenin. Like it's almost one of his first things he does when he gets in, isn't it? Is to set up an internal facing and external facing secret police.
Exactly. There is an enormous literature, don't need to tell you about this, that about Stalin and Stalinism, but so many of the characteristics of what later became Stalinism actually started off under Lenin, right from the outset. But I think just to sort of add a word of caution so your listeners don't get the wrong impression here. Yes, there was the early Soviet secret police, the Cheka, which became later known as the KGB. But I think it's also important to say in terms of scope and scale, It wasn't anything like it became later on in the century. But your point still stands that, and the point that I make in the book, I think still stands, that even though the early Soviet secret police and its foreign intelligence department wasn't of the same scale as it later became, compared to what was going on in Western countries, in Britain and in the United States, it was far more sophisticated and had far more resources than they did. I mean, let's just, to your point, as we started off this conversation, in 1945, President Truman decided to shut down America's wartime foreign intelligence agency, the OSS. So at those two crucial moments, between 1945 and 1947, the US government did not have a dedicated foreign intelligence agency. It only established that in 1947 with the CIA. So that is what I was really thinking of in terms of bringing a toy bow and arrow to a gunfight.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, it's incredible, isn't it, that they dissolved the OSS, but it also reflects the point that you make that pre-war, because in your book you say very clearly that the Second World War is the fulcrum around which all of this kind of changes, because obviously the British and the Americans then developed massive security services during that period. But pre-war, the Americans really had nothing, right? No. And the British had some people, but it wasn't really, it was nothing like the scale of what the Soviets were doing, and even though the Soviets it wasn't the scale that it would be later, it was still it was still more advanced than those two.
Certainly the trade, it's on two different levels. In terms of Soviet tradecraft and capabilities, they were deploying the kind of tradecraft that would later characterize the later period of the Cold War: deep cover illegals, espionage, targeting, recruiting agents in sort of the hallways of power, both in London, in Britain, and in Washington. It's certainly the case that the US government was conducting intelligence done by particular departments. The US Army had its own intelligence component, the Navy had its own intelligence component, but the crucial thing, and I would point in the direction of Mark Stout, an excellent intelligence historian who's got a new book out about early US intelligence in the First World War and after, which shows there was a lot more going on than perhaps the usual depiction would suggest. But the key point is that even though different parts of the US government were conducting intelligence, collecting intelligence and delivering it to policymakers, the crucial point is that there wasn't a dedicated intelligence agency, and it became a mess with different competing bureaucracies delivering intelligence to senior decision makers in Washington. And in the book, I describe this sort of absolutely farcical procedures that the US Army and Navy were at such loggerheads with each other that they could only agree on delivering signals intelligence, decrypts, to the White House. The only way that they could agree to do this is by doing it on alternating days. So, okay, like Monday you do it, Tuesday I do it. I mean, you can't imagine a less efficient way of delivering intelligence to, and it was all about bureaucratic turf wars, infighting, personalities, and so on. So US government, and famously, the US infamously did have a black chamber, a code-breaking black chamber in the First World War. But the Secretary of State, Henry Stimson, infamously decided to close it down on the grounds that, quote, gentlemen don't read each other's mail. So that black chamber was exactly the kind of thing that I'm talking about, a dedicated, not owing its allegiance to one particular agency, and therefore, riddled with bureaucratic problems of only representing one part of the government. But the Black Chamber was closed down, as I said, and it meant that as the Second World War approached, the US government did not have a dedicated foreign intelligence, either human intelligence or signals intelligence body, and that lay in sharp contrast to the Soviets. The Brits were a bit better, but my God, if you look at the records on the actual capabilities of the manpower that Britain's Foreign Intelligence Agency, MI6, and the security service, MI5, had. It was like laughably small, minuscule resources. So the myth, that's a big correction I tried to show in those pages of the book. The myth of British intelligence, it was much more a myth about the sort of the far-reaching capabilities of Britain's secret service in the approach to the Second World War than the reality.
Don't you make a quip in the book that the Soviet government on the eve of war had more Cambridge undergraduates in their
Well,
than
yeah,
the
and I
British?
think, yeah, exactly. No, it's absolutely ridiculous. That the fact is that I think that there were, in MI5 and MI6, there was one or maybe two graduates, i.e. people who had an undergraduate degree. Dick White was one, and there was another one whose name I'm forgetting. But yes, the sort of the absurd statistic then is that the Soviet intelligence had more graduates, i.e. the Cambridge Five, working for it than Britain's own intelligence services did on the outbreak of the Second World War. You can't imagine a more perverse situation.
No, it's extraordinary. The other so the one of the interesting things about that is that there's obviously a logistical asymmetry between the West and the East at this point, but there's also an ideological asymmetry feeding into this, right? So you've got, in the 30s is the great era of the illegals, these fanatically Marxist recruits who are going out to find ideologically committed people in America and Britain.
Yeah.
And it's an extraordinary era, isn't it? The stories are incredible.
The stories are incredible, and they in many ways they write themselves. I'm thinking of, in particular, the recruiter of the Cambridge Five, Arnold Deutsch, a great sort of cosmopolitan Eastern European illegal. But it's also important, I think, to perhaps read his story with a bit more skepticism than we find certainly in Kremlin-based narratives of the so-called great illegals. There's much romanticism, particularly being churned out by KGB and now Russian government propaganda about the great illegals. Reading Arnold Deutsch's MI5 dossier that is now declassified, he actually came to the UK under his own name. So this, if the UK, yeah, master spy, if the UK security establishment had been doing their job a little bit better, they would have been able to cross-check him and perhaps would have been on his case a little bit earlier than they were. But the fact is, as I sort of, the conclusion I come to in the book is that yes, there were extraordinary successes with the recruitment of agents on both sides of the Atlantic, but they were also equally just abysmal security failures on the part of both the British and the American governments. And I would actually look at it more that way, that it's not necessarily sophisticated spy work being done by the Soviet intelligence. It's more just abysmal security on the part of in Whitehall and in Washington.
But is that partly the kind of same naivety that saw them closing the Black Chamber? After the unmasking of all these spies, it's very obvious that the security should have been tightened, but we're talking before the unmasking of all these spies, and it was unthinkable, wasn't it?
Well, I think on the US and on this side of the Atlantic, where I'm speaking to you from, I think that this fed into the whole era of isolationism, of anti-intervention in Europe, that espionage was something that the old world did, and America didn't need to do that. There's a strong thread of that throughout the records from the time. Yes, the FBI existed and was a powerful force, but it wasn't anything like the manpower that it later become and is today. In the UK, there were officers who were acutely aware of the scope and scale of Soviet intelligence, but again, it's sort of like an age of innocence compared to what it later became. So to gain access to, if you're going through vetting, background checks to get into either the intelligence services or to have access to sensitive classified information in the UK government, the process was called negative vetting, and that meant, well, as opposed to positive vetting, negative vetting meant that a candidate who was seeking to, an applicant who was seeking to gain access to state secrets, his or her name would be looked up against MI5's records. That system sounds good, but it relies on the fact that MI5 records would have found traces of this person in ways that would set off alarm bells. So to focus on what we're talking about at the moment, it relied on the whole thing relied on, if you were a communist, you would perhaps go to meetings of the Communist Party, be a member of communist affiliated groups, and that those interactions with the sort of ostensible outward manifestations of communism would lead to so-called traces in MI5's registry of records. Well, Arnold Deutsch, who we just mentioned previously, the recruiter, the great illegal, the recruiter of the Cambridge spies, knew perfectly well, he guessed accurately that if his recruits purposefully distanced themselves from all forms of outward communism, then there wouldn't be any traces in MI5's records for them to detect. And that's essentially what happened, was by distancing themselves from the Communist Party, Socialist Party, and so on after they left Cambridge in the 1930s. There were few traces, if any, in MI5 records, and the few traces that they did that did exist on the Cambridge spies and other agents could simply be dismissed during a conversation with whoever was conducting the vetting, as a sort of, oh, this was just a youthful dalliance in communism, and nothing more.
Even when there were traces, it didn't seem to matter. I mean, I always think it's extraordinary. James Klugman, for example, I mean, he was deeply embedded in the Communist Party, deeply vocal about being embedded in the Communist Party, and then basically became in charge of our SOE operations in Yugoslavia.
I know. I know. Well, I think what I would caution, or the slight twist on that, is that, of course, that was, I think I'm right in saying that was after the Soviet Union joined the war on the side of Britain, and that for all said and done, people like James Klugman were extraordinarily useful for SOE, despite not because of his communist past. So that was also going on, and we see that loud and clear in the declassified dossier of the Soviet atom spy Klaus Fuchs, the German emigre, and you can see the sort of the deliberations in real time of how MI5 went about vetting Fuchs in the early stages of the war. They knew that Fuchs, who had emigrated from Nazi Germany, well, he was a refugee, he fled to Britain, and then did like state-of-the-art cutting-edge atomic research at various UK universities. UK authorities, MI5, knew that he was anti-Nazi, but they did not know at that time how pro-Soviet he was. And there were two different, you can see it in the people that were looking through his dossier at the time. There were two different camps saying that there's no way he should be allowed near atomic research, and then other people saying, look, we've got references from the foremost researchers in atomic research at the time, and we've also got it on good authority that he's the only one that can do these theoretical calculations. So in order for Britain to be able to build an atomic bomb, we got to have him on board. So needless to say, the vetting went through. It was a catastrophe, as everyone learned later on, because he was a Soviet spy throughout his time in the British and then the US atom bomb project.
Let's talk a little bit about during the war, because one of the fascinating things about this asymmetry that you highlight so well in the book is that during the war, when we became allies with the Soviet Union, we were quite kind of squeamish about spying on them, a bit hypocritically occasionally, because we were spying on lots of other allies. But the Soviets weren't at all squeamish. In fact, you point out that actually when they become allies with us, they actually ramp up their operations against us.
That's right. There was a Foreign Office mantra that, as far as the Soviets were concerned, one doesn't spy on one's allies, which is just, but as you point out, I mean, the UK was certainly collecting intelligence on neutral countries at the time. opening the diplomatic bags of countries like Spain and Portugal. And there's some evidence of that going on regarding Swiss authorities as well. But certainly as soon as Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, the Foreign Office was adamant that there would be no further offensive intelligence collection by British authorities on the Soviet Union. Now, there was a clever little workaround because there were people in the UK intelligence establishment that said, come on, like the Soviet beast isn't going to change, and this isn't going to go away. We need to have at least one eye on them, albeit with limited resources. So certainly Bletchley Park was able to collect intelligence on the Soviet Union through German decrypts. So that was legitimate. They could basically continue collecting by collecting on German intercepts about the Soviet Union. And indeed, those were carefully filed away. And then after 1945, they became extraordinarily useful. But it is an absolutely extraordinary state of affairs, and that many of the Soviet spy scandals in the post-war, post-1945 years, I think could have been avoided if there had been a little bit more intelligence collection on allies by the British and the Americans during the Second World War. So actually spying on allies, it's a sort of perhaps un-PC thing to say, but can actually be important when world events turn around and suddenly a former ally becomes an adversary.
There was, though, I mean, there was this growing dawning that the Soviet Union as our ally was likely to become an adversary from, I guess, the middle of 44 onwards, would you say?
I think yeah.
At that point, right, the situation changes, doesn't it? We start rethinking our intelligence priorities a little bit. Maybe a little bit.
There's a little bit. There are sort of dissenting voices. There are people with one eye on the prize in terms of the Soviets in the post-war years. Peter Hennessy, in his wonderful book, The Secret State, years ago now, he pointed out that actually, though, the Joint Intelligence Committee.
With new, gentler scented Clorox disinfecting wipes, clean finally smells as good as it feels on everything from lamps to ceiling fans, even on your kid's toy shark. Oh, ouch. Clorox disinfecting wipes, now available in crisp lemon. Find it on Amazon. Clorox, clean feels good.
Meet the computer you can talk to. With Copilot on Windows, working, creating, and collaborating is as easy as talking. Got writer's block? Share your screen with Copilot Vision to help spark inspiration, and use Copilot Voice to have a conversation and brainstorm ideas. Or maybe you need some tech help. With Copilot Vision, Copilot sees what you see. Let Copilot talk you through step-by-step guidance so you can master new apps, games, and skills faster. Try now at windows.com/Copilot.
The sort of the apex of the UK intelligence establishment, they didn't have a dedicated report on the Soviet Union from, I think it was between 1944 and 1946. So in other words, at exactly the moment when you thought that they would be reprioritizing things, it was just sort of conspicuously absent. Different services did sort of gear up towards the Soviet threat. So I think it was in 1943, MI6 established its own section dealing with Soviet affairs and Soviet counter-espionage. Unfortunately, one of its heads in 1944, I believe it was none other than Kim Philby. So one eye on the future, brace ourselves for impact with the Soviet Union. Let's appoint Kim Philby to be the head of that department at MI6. Oh dear, he's actually a Soviet spy. So it's a story with many twists and many tales. The history of espionage really does have few comparable episodes where the head of the department dealing with Soviet espionage is himself a Soviet spy.
Do we think it's like a high point in Soviet penetration that last year or so of the war, because they have amazing information from the Foreign Office, from MI5, from MI6, from Washington. I mean, we concentrate a lot on the Cambridge Five, but the American state is absolutely riddled with spies at this point as well.
Every single branch of President Roosevelt's wartime administration was penetrated by Soviet intelligence. That's revealed in the so-called Venona decrypts. OSS, America's wartime foreign intelligence agency, was probably the most penetrated agency ever in history. There were the Soviet moles throughout OSS. And in fact, OSS director William Wild Bill Donovan, he quipped once that he would put Stalin on the payroll of OSS if it meant defeating Hitler. Obviously, he meant that as a joke, but actually he was more accurate than he knew, because his right-hand man in OSS was a Soviet agent. But it was an existential, this is, it's flippant to be sort of armchair critics at this distance of time, but it was an existential struggle against the Third Reich, against the Axis powers, and the Soviet Union was spilling more blood than any other power to defeat them. So, and there was a legitimate defense in the post-war years during the successive spy scandals that came to light. Each of the big Soviet spies who were unmasked in different shapes, different forms, used the same defense, which was actually all I was doing was handing information over to a wartime ally, which is true on one level, but it's still an unauthorized disclosure of information. It is not your right to decide what to declassify and what not to. That's not your job as an intelligence officer.
And also, to be fair, a fair number of them were also handing over those secrets when Stalin and Hitler were effectively allies during the Nazi-Soviet alliance. So
that's the chapter that certainly the Kremlin doesn't like to. If you look at the Russian embassy in the UK, their Twitter feed, and similar in the US, for the US Russian embassy, the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, effectively alliance, is completely airbrushed out of the Kremlin's narrative today. They don't want to remember that. They don't want to also remember the meetings and collaboration, and there's some evidence of intelligence sharing between the NKVD, Soviet intelligence, NKVD, and the SS, the Nazi SS formations, particularly in occupied territories in Poland. A really dark chapter of history that is, as I said, airbrushed out of existence by the Kremlin today.
Let's move to beyond the war. At what point do you think the British and the Americans begin to realize that they've got toy bow and arrow against a machine gun?
So certainly 1947 is the sort of the fulcrum year in the US, with the passing of the National Security Act, which set up the CIA and created the modern US national security state. That came obviously hot on the heels of Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. It was, the same time as the Truman Doctrine and so on. So there was a convergence of, I would call it like a realization of, oh shit, we need to do something about this. We are monstrously unprepared. But different parts of the government had different moments of realization. And I would actually point to, as I tried to show in the book, there was the defection of a Soviet military intelligence, GRU cipher clerk in Canada, in Ottawa, at the very end of the Second World War, like immediately the month after the end of the Second World War. Igor Gusenko defected in Ottawa and brought with him a tranche of records which revealed GRU documents, which revealed the nature and the scope and scale of previous Soviet wartime espionage. This was just a really uncomfortable, ugly reality that certainly the US government, Truman at the time, did not want to have to deal with. And reading the newly opened correspondence between Attlee in Britain, Mackenzie King, the leader of the Prime Minister of Canada, and President Truman. Truman was effectively putting his head in the sand about this, just not wanting to have to deal with this spy scandal, which showed showed clearly that the Soviets had penetrated the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb project. Attlee and his foreign secretary, Ernest Bevin, were much more realistic about this and were pushing for a sort of concerted response by the Western governments to the Soviet threat. But this was toxic on the international stage at the moment. Truman and his Secretary of State were still holding out hope of finding a deal with the Soviets about managing atomic power and energy going forward. So this this is an example of where a spy scandal, a spy story could have ignited international relations. And sure enough, in the passing of time, over the ensuing months and years, there was this dawning realization, at least in Washington, that, oh, what Igor Gouzenko was showing initially really was the case, because more and more spies became unmasked in the years going forward.
I mean, there was presumably, I mean, in Truman's defense on that issue, there was just such a sort of sense of relief that the war was over and unwillingness to accept that they were entering a new era where there was a new enemy. They didn't have the capacity to even contemplate it.
Total exhaustion. I mean, Britain was effectively bankrupt, so that's the end of that. The US government, there was still that heavy isolationist theme in the US politics of, okay, we were involved, we helped win that war, but we don't need to, this is an old world problem. This is Russia, Soviet Union, and Europe, not us. So that was a really powerful theme in the US politics at the time. So yeah, it's maybe we'll come on to this in the next episode, but there's a striking parallel, it seems to me, of basically what we're talking about is how a national security establishment is geared overwhelmingly to focus on one national security threat. That is to say, the defeat of the Axis powers. And I see that there being a direct parallel with post 9/11 counterterrorism, where resources on both sides of the Atlantic are thrown overwhelmingly into counterterrorism at the expense of resurgent great powers, Russia and China. So the picture that we get, it seems to me, is that the US government in particular is very good about doing one thing at one time and very bad about doing two things at one time. So this huge juggernaut that is the US government, once it gets going, it really gets going, but it's not good about long-term strategic threat analysis or precautions.
So it gets going in this period, so post 47, and then we're through into the Cold War proper, as we think of it, rather than the opening skirmishes. And just talk us through how, I mean, gosh, in brief of an enormous subject, how we kind of get to a situation where there's more parity between the kind of three services. Yeah.
So I think really this chapter, this part of the book is really, it becomes about a sort of standoff, eyeball to eyeball, to use the famous phrase during the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's successive problems, failures on the part of Western services recruiting old-fashioned agents behind the Iron Curtain. So the US government, the Western governments, increasingly look to technological solutions to what human intelligence is failing. And at the same time, the Soviet Union also gear up, continue with human intelligence, but also gear up their own technological solutions. And I'm thinking here about, in particular, yes, signals intelligence, but overhead reconnaissance and then satellites. So, which I think your question is getting at is really this period of the post-war, once the bureaucracies are in place, once both sides recognize that they're in this struggle, what actual role did intelligence services on either side of the Iron Curtain? What did it actually do? And I think certainly during the acute moments of crisis, like the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, we can see how intelligence, both from human sources and from signals intelligence, contributed directly to President Kennedy's decision-making during that crisis. What contribution did intelligence make to the Cold War? I think it made an important, on this on both sides, contribution to stabilizing the Cold War. And how did it do that? Through the series of arms limitation and reduction treaties after the Cuban Missile Crisis that the Western governments and the Soviet Union signed. What most historians have not fully appreciated is that those treaties, arms reduction treaties, basically the world came to the edge of a nuclear abyss during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then leaders on both sides of the Iron Curtain realized this was too dangerous to do again. So these series of arms limitation and then reduction treaties were only made possible by intelligence collection. And that really hasn't received the attention it deserves in the literature of the Cold War. So this is basically
in the sense that the intelligence provided evidence of good faith where otherwise there might have been assumptions of bad faith.
100%. So this is President Reagan later on in the Cold War had the turn of phrase, trust but verify. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. So it was the verification process of these treaties. So in other words, both sides, each side signed up to the treaty, and each side expressly in the treaty agreed to allow the other to deploy what they called their national technical means. So this is expressly in the treaties. And that's effectively a combination of signals intelligence and overhead imagery intelligence from satellites. So in other words, both sides knew that they were each spying in minute detail about each other's nuclear arsenals, making sure that each side would comply with the arms reduction treaties. That wouldn't have been possible without mutual intelligence collection. So that's a really striking example of how intelligence used by both sides helped to stabilize the Cold War and prevent, I would argue, the Cold War turning hot into nuclear war.
There's a really good example of this that you talk about in your book as well, about kind of where intelligence had an impact on the Cold War leaders' perceptions in a really fundamental way, which was around Oleg Gordievsky. Can you just talk us
That's right. That was the other. So again, it's sort of writing these books. I'm sure your listeners who have written books will agree. One can get lost quite quickly in the sort of the rabbit hole of espionage and counter-espionage, and it's quite much more difficult to ask oneself, well, what did this actually all mean? And I think the Gordievsky story, which has been known about for some time, but is still worth retelling, is really significant in terms of the intelligence that he provided. So Oleg Gordievsky was a Soviet KGB officer who rose up to become the head of station, chief of station for the KGB in London, all the while being a MI6 SIS agent and feeding MI6 intelligence about both the KGB and what Soviet leaders were thinking. And what Gordievsky revealed was that Soviet leaders were genuinely afraid of the Western powers. What Gordievsky revealed was that the Soviet leaders were genuinely afraid of Western powers, and that all of Reagan's tough talk about the evil empire was simply fanning the flames for Soviet fears about it, rather than the Soviet Union actually coming from a position of strength. Soviet leaders quite rightly understood just how weak the Soviet Union was regarding the West, particularly the US. And what Gordievsky's intelligence revealed was to expose that. Now, we can't, using the publicly available information, Reagan's diaries, Margaret Thatcher's papers, and so on, you can't precisely marry up when Gordievsky's intelligence came online and how Reagan's policy-making, decision-making changed. Because leaders genuinely don't write in their diaries, oh, I received some extraordinary intelligence from an MI6 agent today, and it's changed my thinking on X, Y, and Z. But you can marry up Reagan's public speeches about the Soviet Union, and when we know Gordievsky's intelligence from MI6 to the CIA started coming through to the White House, and what do we find? That he absolutely starts to scale down the rhetoric. So clearly the message had got through to Reagan via Margaret Thatcher and from MI6 that actually all of your rhetoric about the evil empire is simply making matters worse as far as the Soviet leaders are concerned. So it was one of those moments, really a game changer, where espionage, old-fashioned human espionage, can lead to a massive strategic realignment. I point your listeners, of course, in the direction of Ben McIntyre's excellent book about Gordievsky. It came out a couple of years ago. As I said, the story's been told and retold, but it is just the most remarkable story. And then, of course, there's the older, for those interested, there's the older history of the KGB that Christopher Andrew wrote with Oleg Gordievsky himself, which is stood the test of time.
That just raises a kind of thematic bit of your book, rather than a chronological one, which we'll come back to the chronology in a minute, about the interaction between leadership and intelligence. That intelligence, on its own means nothing unless you have leaders who are either interested in it or good at using it, or indeed bad at using it, because sometimes it can create catastrophic things when intelligence fails. Can you just talk us through your thoughts on that?
I think there is a correct balance to be made between decision maker leaders who understand intelligence and are willing to use it, but there's an imbalance then, as your question suggests, of leaders who just aren't interested in it. Thinking closer to our own time, Donald Trump obviously completely uninterested in what the US intelligence community has to say. That's no great secret. But Nixon himself wasn't interested in what the CIA had to say. So that's on the one side, leaders who just aren't interested in what the intelligence communities have to say. But then there's also an equally dangerous slippery slope of leaders that are imbued with conspiracy and love secrets and think that it answers has all the answers to the world. Obviously, those kind of leaders are more common in one-party regimes, Stalin or Putin today, but they also exist in Western governments of people that just love the thrill of the secret state. So there is this healthy balance, I think, as with anything. I mean, intelligence at the end of the day, it's another form of information that will help decision makers make their decision. It's designed to give decision advantage. It's one form of information, but of course, decision makers have streams of information coming in, and it's up to them to use intelligence. When it all works well, they can interrogate the intelligence that's being disseminated to them and understand it critically. And then the key point is that you don't see, I think, in a lot of books about this, or more theoretical books of intelligence, is that then there's like an interactive process between intelligence agency and the briefer and the decision maker. So I've had the good fortune to talk to several US president's daily briefers, PDB briefers, whose job was to brief the president and other senior decision makers in the White House. And it's absolutely an iterative process. Here's our briefing for today. Then there's a series of questions. Then the whole machine starts again, following up on those questions. And then there's the next day or even sooner, there are answers to those questions. That's when it all works really well. There's this interactive and iterative process of intelligence, that nexus between decision makers and the intelligence agencies. That's where the magic happens, or, as you say, doesn't happen. But I think that, to get back to your original question, my own view is that a healthy degree of skepticism is necessary when, as with anything in life, but in particular, if I were ever receiving an intelligence briefing, I'd want to know where it's coming from. Is it human intelligence? Is it signals intelligence? And then also just interrogate that as you would do any other form of reporting.
Calder, one of the things in your book that I hadn't appreciated was the role of intelligence in the collapse of the Soviet Union. But what I think we're going to do, you very, very kindly agreed to come back and do another episode. And I think we will the collapse of the Soviet Union and the intelligence, how intelligence played into that. And then the incredible story of the post-Soviet intelligence world. And the even more incredible story, I think, of the current situation with regard to China, which is a terrifying note on which you end your book.
Yeah. Love to do that. That will be great.
Wonderful.
And I look forward to that. I mean, the exciting thing, just to sort of whet your appetite, is that I hope it comes across as quite modest in those chapters of the book, which is this is actually work in progress. That this is more records are being declassified. Each year revealing a new layer into that period. And of course, we're seeing the clash with China unfold in real time in front of us on our TV screens. So that chapter of the book is very much work in progress, unfolding as we speak. But I do have some quite strong opinions that I'd love to share with you next time.
You do, and I will very much look forward to it. In the meantime, I would highly recommend that everybody goes out and buy your book, which is just out in paperback, and it's absolutely brilliant. So do buy that. And Calder, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was great.
Thank you for listening to Spy Masters Podcast. Don't miss the next instalment of our chat with Dr. Walton, where we'll be talking about the intelligence implications of the end of the Cold War. We'll be talking about Putin and how he turned the FSB into his own private mafia. And we'll be talking about the rise of Chinese espionage, which is quite sinister stuff. So don't miss it. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll see you next time.